Imagine this. You are a Romanian millennial. I know it sucks, but please indulge me for a second. And while your parents may or may not have taken the time to have the talk with you, there's a high probability you witness at least once in your life the other talk. The Ceausescu talk. Yes, I know. Communism, Ceausescu, why can't you just get over it? Like, seriously. The man is definitely the ex an entire nation cannot really move on from. And we've been skipping our therapy sessions like we're all baby Tates who think that doing anything other than repressing is gay. And so the talk is this strangely Stockholm Syndrome-like endeavor that many of our parents kept engaging in with one another to try and explain away their collective trauma. The collective trauma of living through a grueling decade of austerity with little hope or knowledge about how long their state of deprivation would last, why exactly it had been inflicted upon them, and with little to no room for relieving the pressure through protests. The memory of a bloody December 1989, in which they went from the ecstasy of seeing the dictator couple flee by helicopter and the euphoria of chanting for freedom in the streets, to many families mourning for their dead as the aforementioned streets became killing grounds. And then the confusion of the following years, in which everything seemed to change. The rule book was torn up, any social contract voided, but somehow, so many familiar faces from yesteryear remained in charge. Communism had died, arguably way before the regime actually fell, but those in power stayed in power. As you can imagine, this paradox gave way to many heated conversations ever since. While across a multitude of commie block apartments there might have been different versions of the talk, most of them touched on the following 3 points. 1. How Ceausescu left the country free of any foreign debt. 2. How that was a very good thing indeed. And 3. How, were it not for the cock-ups of the 90s, we'd basically be giving Germany our hand-me-downs and high-fiving with the big guns of the world. But what's the deal with this foreign debt? Why is it so important for the average Romanian to frame their evaluation of the communist regime around it? After all, few of those referencing this mythic foreign debt could say much about its origins, mostly because the dear leader, unaccountable as he was to the general public, provided very few details about it. Fewer still would talk about the 2 oil crises of the 1970s, the worldwide events that made these loans so fatal to all communist regimes across Europe, and I think it's safe to say that hardly anyone in my parents' generation took a broader view of these same energy crises as the origin of some of the worldwide issues we've been struggling with for decades now, like deindustrialization, union busting, and the general enshittification of what used to be called the welfare state, for those lucky enough geographically to have experienced such a thing, of course. So,
we'll do it live! Fuck it! Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
Part 1. The dangers of unpegging. A bit of mise-en-scène before we get to the main inciting event. With the horrors of World War II and memories of destitution and despair from the Great Depression still fresh in people's memories, Western leaders had a mandate to reconfigure the international order in a way that things might suck a bit less. In his book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, David Graeber argues that one of the main aims and achievements of this post-war reshuffling was to ward off the specter of a massive working-class uprising. To put it crudely, the white working class of the North Atlantic countries, from the United States to West Germany, were offered a deal. If they agreed to set aside any fantasies of fundamentally changing the nature of the system, then they would be allowed to keep their unions, enjoy a wide variety of social benefits from pensions to vacations to healthcare, and perhaps, most importantly, through generously funded and ever-expanding public educational institutions, know that their children had a reasonable chance of leaving the working class entirely. This arrangement resulted in the long summer of prosperity, a period of worldwide economic expansion that was so great that across the 27 years leading up to the 70s, only 38 financial crises were recorded, a fraction of the 139 that would follow in the next 20-something years. Amazing! And all this was made possible by a series of economic principles enshrined in a monetary management mechanism called the Bretton Woods system. Don't we just love a good monetary management mechanism, fellas? Under this arrangement, the US would act as a sort of guarantor, with every other country using the dollar as a point of reference for their own currency, in a fixed exchange rate system. To that end, America engaged in some pegging of the dollar to gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This was meant to guarantee full gold convertibility for anyone who wanted to exchange their dollars for the shiny metal. Now, things seemed to go according to plan until sometimes in the early 70s, when the cost of the Vietnam War finally caught up with the US. In order to continue funding the war, as well as its government spending, America decided that it was time for and flooded markets with dollars. Problem was that the Bretton Woods system only allowed for minor exchange rate fluctuations, so other countries had to fire up their own money printers in an effort to keep within the limits. Basically, the US started exporting inflation to the rest of the world. Concerned about the decreasing value of their dollar deposits, the British and French government tried to claim back the value of their dollars in gold. However, as the French were doing French things, sending over a destroyer to Fort Knox to claim their precious, Nixon did what few US presidents ever got to do and pulled out of the dollar's gold convertibility altogether. Graeber described how the immediate effect of Nixon's unpegging of the dollar was to cause the price of gold to skyrocket. It hit a peak of $600 an ounce in 1980. This, of course, had the effect of causing US gold reserves to increase dramatically in value. The value of the dollar, as denominated in gold, plummeted. The result was a massive net transfer of wealth from poor countries, which lacked gold reserves, to rich ones, like the United States and Great Britain, that maintained them. When Nixon pulled the plug on gold convertibility, oil-exporting countries were anything but amused, because the sheer amount of dollars hitting the international markets meant that oil sales as well as savings in dollars that these countries had amassed were dropping in value, and fast. Adding fuel to that fire, for the first time since the end of World War II, US domestic oil extraction could no longer meet internal demand, creating a deliciously favorable situation to leverage access to oil for political purposes. And the spark that set it all off was America's decision to support Israel in its war against Egypt and Syria. So, in 1973, OPEC members voted to institute an embargo on oil sales and cut production. Now, the endless queues at gas stations, extended blackouts, layoffs due to reduced production numbers, and eventual deindustrialization are some of the more straightforward effects of this energy crisis. But while people were struggling with inflation and cost of living, someone, and by someone I mean sickos on Wall Street, was asking the all-important question: won't someone think of the money? What money? Well, all the juicy petrodollars that these OPEC members were collecting as a result of those inflated oil prices and had limited ability to reinvest in their own economies. And this is where we pivot all the way to Part 2, Loans for the Comrades. Much of the public angst around the Cold War was about it turning red hot, and while things could get dicey at times, the reason why the West ended up patting itself on the back for winning the Cold War had very little to do with space lasers or who had the most but also super rugged and manly army. And while the CIA is known to meddle and certainly doesn't mind being portrayed by people who enjoy a straightforward villain as this ruthlessly efficient coup machine, I'd argue that, as ever, the least sexy culprit is the one that did it. What I'm saying is, it was the interest rates that tripped up the comrades. Well, that and the arguably idiotic, callous and self-aggrandizing decisions of the communist top brass when faced with a financial crisis. But let's not worry about that for the time being and focus on the financial entanglements. You see, the Iron Curtain might have been there to draw the line between the two opposing camps within Europe, but it could be surprisingly porous when decision makers wanted it to be. As an international banker, quoted by the Washington Post in 1982, aptly summed up, "All these years we have thought of East-West relations in terms of missiles and terror. Now we are finding that it all really just comes down to money." Indeed, for much of the Cold War, different branches of Western governments were stepping on each other's toes in a wild dance of contradictory measures. On the one hand, the military-industrial complex was engaged in an arms race meant to scare commies to death. On the other, trade promotion agencies, governments and private actors were busy extending loans to both communist and third world leaders, as a sort of goodwill gesture that would encourage better economic and eventually political relations. There was, of course, another reason for this sudden urge to shower comrades with cash. Remember how the OPEC countries had ended up with a fuck ton of money following the first oil crisis? Yeah, and since parking their money in American banks was much sexier than investing in their own citizens' well-being, US banks were mad eager to find an outlet for the endless heaps of petrodollars in their coffers. And as the authors of the same Washington Post article remarked, the banks loaned large sums of money to the Soviet bloc nations, often without government guarantees or security arrangements. The banks assumed that the Soviet Union, which always had taken pride in an excellent credit rating, would not allow its satellites to fall behind in paying their debts. A specialist cited by the New York Times article on the same topic from 1976 argued that while the Russians could run into debt servicing problems, especially if they have to continue importing large quantities of food, resources can be fairly easily diverted in their centrally planned economy to maintain their payments record. In other words, Western creditors knew that their communist debtors were willing to starve their economies and people to back their loans, so keep running up that debt, comrades. Now, on the other end of this equation, Eastern European regimes used Western money for two main purposes: to finance their industrial development and to paper over cracks in their lackluster production of consumer goods for their own citizens. For instance, this is how Romania ended up with the license for a brand new, at the time, Renault car model, which it produced under the name of Dacia. Access to Western money and technology meant that, within a few short years, the country that had been a newcomer in the world of mass-produced automobiles became one of the most viable car producers inside the Eastern Bloc. The West also got its perks from these sorts of collaborations. For instance, Mark Percival argues that since Britain needed to correct its trade imbalance in the 1970s, it found that it had a better chance of increasing exports by selling its wares to Soviet bloc markets rather than Western ones, where they faced stiff competition. That also meant more safety for certain British jobs. By the 1970s, Britain had become the fourth largest exporter to Romania, behind the USSR, West Germany, and Italy. Having looked at the financial side of things, let's not delay the inevitable and talk about the party leaders' boneheaded decisions that only made the crisis more painful for everyday people. To kick things off, the Romanian Communist Party's main developmental model was staunchly Stalinist, obsessively and narrowly focused on industrial development. Think steel plants and oil refineries, petrochemicals, that sort of thing. Consumer goods production, agriculture, or the service sector were a bit of an afterthought and not deemed sexy enough for the party brochure. As I'm sure you'll have no difficulty imagining, none of this bodes well for Romania in a world heading towards 2 energy crises within the same decade. To make matters even more infuriating, there had been warning signs and calls for course correction well in advance. As far back as 1953, party leaders were raising concerns about this development plan. Indeed, Ceausescu's predecessor, Gheorghe Udeș, had declared during political office meetings that we must underline that, first of all, the volume of the investments in relation to the national income was much and unjustifiably pumped up. Secondly, we must show that this inflated volume of the investments was unjustly distributed to the branches of the national economy, thus causing the disproportionate, unscientific development of the heavy industry, of the automotive industry particularly. The other sectors benefited from a series of achievements, but below what could and what should have been achieved if the economy had been guided towards the proportional development of its branches. Also, the achievements of the other sectors were flawed, for almost all the attention was focused on the heavy industry. Despite these observations, Udeș was still betting big on heavy industry for the country's future. Our duty is now to continue to ensure the development of heavy industry, which will hold the leading position in relation to the other sectors, but allotting to it a percentage of investments in line with the real possibilities of the economy, and to ensure a normal, gradual growth rhythm of this sector. However, while this focus made sense during the 1960s and early 1970s, economist Cornel Ban points out that after the first oil shock, Western industrialists stopped to reconsider further development in these areas. For Ceausescu, by contrast, these industries were part of the increasing industrial complexity required by multilaterally developed socialism. And it was based on this image of industrialization that he decided to expand these industries in the mid to late 1970s. Trouble is, after the first oil crisis, credit dried up, interest rates on the loans that could be secured went through the roof and weren't viable anymore. Romania had also relied on its close relations with the Shah of Iran and Saddam Hussein's Iraq to secure access to oil. In fact, throughout the 1970s, Romania had been the largest consumer of Iranian oil across Eastern Europe. Not surprisingly then, the Islamic Revolution and then the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq threw a major spanner in the works for Ceausescu when it came to buying the oil that would power his industrialization dreams. In Perestroika and the Party, national and transnational perspectives on European communist parties in the era of Soviet reform, Stefano Bottoni described Romania as being caught in a vicious circle. It became dependent on foreign loans, and the money was used to back up the national Stalinist industrialization process, ironically designed to ensure Romania's economic independence. Okay, so storm clouds are gathering, things are about to get messy. I think it's time we move on to Part 3, Paying Off Debts and Living to Tell the Tale. For many years, I didn't really think twice about people's assumptions that Ceausescu paying off all the foreign debt would be anything but a good thing. You don't want that, it makes sense. Except governments, just like corporations, are not people, so more often than not, they tend to be immune to common sense. A state's relationship with debt is a bit like Wall Street types and cocaine. They seem unable to properly function without having some, and the moment they stop taking it, something's really off. Or, in the words of an American economist, there's such a thing as too much debt, but also such a thing perhaps as too little. In the new financial landscape, Romania found that loans would be much harder to come by and under increasingly strict conditions, such as decreases in consumption and investment, fewer resources allocated to public services, a devaluation of the national currency, and banking reforms. When Ceausescu first tried to resist these demands, financing was cut off until even this stubborn comrade had to begrudgingly play along. And I emphasize begrudgingly here because, as a former darling of the West, Ceausescu took the lack of preferential treatment from international institutions extremely personally, going so far as calling it a betrayal. With an eye on neighboring Poland and Hungary, who were much more willing to implement reforms in exchange for credit or payment rescheduling, Ceausescu was outraged by what he perceived as an encroachment on the country's sovereignty, as well as a renunciation of the principles of communism. Funnily enough, Ceausescu was also dismissive of Gorbachev's reforms, and the two statesmen were known to deeply despise one another, even as, in the dying years of their regimes, their countries reforged their ties. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear. I'm not trying to paint the IMF or World Bank and their ilk as the grown-ups in this story, whose reasonable demands would have guaranteed smooth sailing for Romania. Over the years, we've seen how their recommendations have wrecked several developing countries' economies. In that regard, Ceausescu's instincts about how Western financiers operated were not far off. Stefano Bottoni cites a statement by an IMF official in June 1981, as Romania was trying to obtain a standby agreement. While the decision to deliberately slow down the growth of the economy was clearly a very difficult one for the Romanian authorities, a change of even more fundamental importance is the acceptance by the authorities of the price and profit mechanism as a guide to the direction of the economy. By a process that will start in 1982, retail prices will also be adjusted to reflect cost at a producer level. In conclusion, I believe that this program, as contained in the letter of intent, the performance criteria and the review clauses give the fund the assurances it must have, both for the first and for subsequent years, that the very substantial resources it is making available to Romania will be employed to achieve adequate adjustment and to further the purposes of the fund. Basically, in exchange for dollars, international finance was drip-feeding capitalism into a dying communist economy. However, and maybe some out there might think I have the wrong kind of politics, but despite the rather nefarious and underhanded ways these institutions have operated and continue to operate, I tend to care more about protecting people and reducing harm to your population in moments of crisis rather than propping up a regime, regardless of how nominally leftist it is. And the fact of the matter is that while the Polish and Hungarian communists opted for compromises that would allow them to protect the living standards of their citizens and help them maintain functional economies, Romania refused to bow to any major reform proposals and became obsessed with repaying the debt as soon as possible at any cost. At any cost to its peasants, of course. You know, because you're a big, wet, independent boy who doesn't want the IMF giving you lip about how your government should cut its spending, because that means underfunded social services, and you're no chum. You know that fucks up your vibes with your homies and undermines your legitimacy, so you assemble the Central Committee and announce,
"We're gonna do it anyway. We're gonna do it anyway. We're gonna do it anyway. We're gonna do it anyway."
And boy, did they ever. But hold on a second, I hear you say. Surely there must have been at least some comrades out there who could have sat down old Nick and told him, "This ain't it, chief," and made him reconsider some of his plans. After all, Poland and Hungary had a different approach to the crisis. Ceausescu's measures were not just a natural product of communist logic. Well, funny you should say that, because the fact that there were so few within Ceausescu's entourage to challenge his ideas had a lot to do with how successful the man had been as a politician. While across many other countries, party leaders were still viewed as the first among equals and were expected to take on board ideas favored by their peers, our boy Nick was a ruthless mean girl who purged his enemies as soon as he got his chance. Once he was named General Secretary, he played up the animosity that was building up between the Romanian Communist Party and the USSR to replace most of the old guard with younger yes-men who had no split loyalties. Turns out, many of them didn't even have strong ideological convictions either, perfect opportunists that they were, which is why I previously argued that communism had been dead as a political project long before December 89. And finally, when it came to really important positions, Ceausescu just promoted members of his extended family and, of course, his wife, to minimize the risk of any dissent. Soon, everyone understood that when the dear leader said jump, the only correct answer was how high, or you became one of the comrades we don't talk about. So it was Nicu's way or the highway. And following his directives, a switch was made towards brutal economic austerity, which saw basic consumer goods such as meat, butter, eggs strictly rationed, along with cuts to basic services such as heating, hot water, or electricity. Oh, and just to be clear, Romania was still importing a fuck ton of oil, but instead of using some of it to heat homes and schools and hospitals, it was channeling it towards its industrial sector that had become gargantuan in size, but whose output was hardly competitive on foreign markets. The lack or scarcity of certain imported materials or technologies played a role in the diminishing quality of these products, along with the fact that as various research fields found their access to scientific publications and know-how from abroad cut off, they were now expected to somehow reverse engineer everything. The result was poor quality products that had to be sold often at a loss for whatever dollars Romania could get for them in order to, say it with me now, pay off the debt so that he could rule his fiefdom in peace. And again, just to put into perspective the callousness of those in power when it came to resource allocation, the annual public spending on health and social welfare assistance in the late 80s totaled only 1/3 of the construction costs for a single coal power plant. In the 70s, Ceausescu equipped the secret services with high-level computer technology imported from the United States to better detect and nip in the bud any dissenting groups that might form. The actions of a man who knew his popularity was at an all-time high, right? Despite all that, once food began to be rationed out and people were overworked and left in the dark and cold in their homes, even in a tightly controlled country such as Romania, things started to get spicy. On the 19th of October 1981, miners in Valea Motrului started a protest to complain about their harsh working conditions and the lack of proper food. However, the authorities swooped in and managed to stop the whole thing within hours. This sort of quick clampdown from the communist authorities would become recurrent throughout the decade, whenever there would be any flare-ups. In 1987, in a factory in Iași, workers kidnapped the director and demanded their outstanding wages be paid. The next day, a student protest started spontaneously because of the inhumane living conditions in dorms, with low temperatures due to the lack of heating, no hot water or electricity available on the premises. A few months later, rumblings erupted in Brașov. Once again, people were angry because of unpaid wages and the lack of basic consumer goods and services. Government buildings were stormed and party symbols were destroyed. Protesters were arrested and some of them sent to prison, but all in all, the aim of the secret services was to intervene in a surgical manner so that protests could be cut short, leadership disbanded, and as little public attention drawn towards these flare-ups as possible. Despite the ruthlessness, things were coming to a head. While opposition to the regime within the country's borders came with a lot of risks, the Romanian diaspora became much more active after 1980. As reports of human rights violations by the regime were more and more widely publicized abroad, Ceausescu's image in the West as the only good communist took a major hit, and the Romanian leader became a toxic public figure to be associated with. And then, in an ironic twist, the guy who had made a name for himself as the thorn in the Kremlin's side now started cozying up to the comrades from further east. Apparently, Gorbachev had jokingly commented on this development to one of his advisors that it turns out that Ceausescu and Kim Il-sung are now our best friends, everything with them is just fine, and we've forgotten our grievances. Meanwhile, in another equally ironic twist of fate, because Western creditors of Romania wanted to recoup their money, they became increasingly obsessed with the internal stability of Ceausescu's regime. Thus, things that would have pleased Western political leaders, such as civil unrest or any public expression of discontent from the population that could have led to a regime collapse, Western financiers wanted to avoid at all cost because of the risk of insolvency. While Reagan administration officials were arguing for using economic warfare to produce riots that would lead to regime changes across Eastern Europe, banks were like, "Yes, darling, I know that sucks, but just let him finish paying me back." By the spring of 1989, Romania had repaid its foreign debt, at great cost to its population and its economy, which was in the roughest possible shape. But surely that's all history, and now the party could start to ease the austerity and let people know that a much brighter future lay ahead, right? Right? That's one of the things I heard again and again from my parents and their friends as I was growing up. If only they wouldn't have overthrown him, Ceausescu would have finally returned the country to its better days, possibly even turning this debt-free champion into a regional superpower. But the facts, as presented by the minutes of the meetings between the highest echelons of the Romanian Communist Party, suggest otherwise. Despite members of his cabinet pleading with him to at least not keep people in the dark and cold and ease up on food rationing, Ceausescu felt entitled to squeeze his citizens for a while more. Both because he had plans to transform Romania into a creditor to the global south and other such flights of fancy, but also because he felt he was righteously acting like the stern daddy Romanians needed to become more efficient working bees. A few final words. A few years ago, I was watching an episode of a series produced by the Romanian National Television on what I guess could be called community centers. Căminul Cultural, as it was called in Romanian, was an important third place, as the kids like to call it nowadays. A place outside the home, work, or even the local church or pub for people to meet and do stuff together, predominantly in villages. Now, these places were primarily designed for the ideological education of villagers, but for a while, the authorities were pretty understanding of the fact that people would use them in whatever way they felt benefited the community. Many people had fond memories of parties, weddings, or other celebrations they enjoyed there. But then, something interesting happened. As austerity kicked in and people started having trouble heating their own homes, let alone social spaces, packs of reporters started making unannounced visits to rural community centers. What they would then try to record was a weird public shaming ritual in which they berated locals either for leaving the space, fall into disrepair, or for converting it into a discotheque. You know, basically one of the only good uses for a cold-ass hole, as you could let hormonal teenagers and youngsters try to at least dance away the freezing temperatures. People caught on camera look embarrassed, but not really ashamed, because this moralizing from on high sounded extremely hollow on an empty stomach. Especially since everyone knew that we weren't all in it together, as high-ranking party members and those involved with the secret services got their needs met through a parallel economy. Coupled with the Ceausescus calling their own citizens fat and lazy and in need of some tough love, I guess that a fake moralizing stance goes hand in hand with a diminished capacity to respond to the needs of those you govern and a loss of legitimacy. It's the peasants, you see. Their bellies are too full, which makes them insolent and a bit too fond of disco. I wish my parents and others who still occasionally have the Ceausescu talk would remember the anger and betrayal they must have felt during those long cold nights and days of the 80s. Not because anyone needs to remember that communism bad, God knows we've had that repeated to us ever since the regime fell, ironically enough, mostly by people who were part of those power structures, but because being angry at the right things in our past is a good exercise for being angry at the right things in our present. Knowing who did what and the context in which they opted for one choice over another helps you understand that it's not always as easy as the CIA did this and the CIA did that, as if countries outside the main global powers don't have their own political elites that can fuck things up. It helps you understand that, or the lack thereof, means different things to individuals and governments, and that authoritarian leaders profess love for their country and its well-being means jack shit, when it turns out that they've convinced themselves that their aspirations and their people's needs are somehow one and the same thing. Thank you very much for sticking around until the very end, and if I might be so bold as to ask you, please like, rate, follow or subscribe to Totally Unrelated, depending on which platform you've enjoyed this episode on. It's taken me quite some time to put this together, as it often happens with topics that I have a personal connection with, but it's ended up as quite a useful exercise to help me clarify some of the things that felt wrong during the Ceausescu talk throughout the years. Hopefully it has provided you with some semblance of use as well, or at least a smidge of entertainment. And hopefully it has also been a nice follow-up to the previous episode on how Romanian boomers, so to speak, were so in love with conspiracy theories even before they were cool. Anyway, thanks again for bearing with me and hope to see you next time. Bye!